Welcome, TMBS Sunday Economics Series here. I'm, of course, Michael Brooks, along with super producer Matt Leck, manning the ship here. Joining us today is return guest, senior reporter for Huffington Post, author of the new book, Price of Peace, Money, Democracy, and the Life of John Maynard Keynes. Zach Carter joins us. Zach, thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
Of course. So we're going to get to Keynes in a little bit, and but let's start with this slew of bailout packages that we've been sort of going through with Corona, and let's work backwards. What is in the HEROES Act that the Democrats have put forward? And I guess just lay out the main themes. You know, what's in it? Why does Nancy Pelosi need to marginalize progressive forces even when what they want to do is relatively popular in a big, broad sense? And three, it's a statement bill. So how much of this is even in play anyways, even the kind of watered down version?
Well, the short answer is very little. Most of the bill is stuff that's designed to please different elements of the Democratic caucus in the House. It's not even really about laying down a marker for where the party stands for the public. It's kind of more about internal caucus dynamics and about what the party represents to people in power in Washington. And it's, in particular, I think it's sort of a marker for the Biden campaign as well. A sense of what and who the Democratic Party is going to be working on and with over the next few years if Biden should win the election in November. And I think in that respect, there's a lot of stuff in the bill that's pretty good. That's much better than what we saw in what I would consider the first bailout package. For a while was being referred to as phase 3, but the big bill that passed in late March. I mean, there's $1 trillion in aid to states. That's money that can go to pay, firefighters and teachers and paint schools and things like that. So that's good. There's a little bit of money for public health. That's good. You need contact tracers and you need people to, fight the pandemic. That's not bad. You need that money. But it is not an all hands on deck effort to address the public health aspect of this crisis. And frankly, I think the amounts that are being considered and the general approach to dealing with the economic side of the crisis is just totally inadequate to the scale of the disaster that we're facing. I mean, we already know that the economy is at the worst level of unemployment since the Great Depression. We already know that it's getting worse, and we don't have any real reason to believe it's going to get better anytime soon. All of this talk about reopening the economy requires people to actually want to go out and buy things, to be able to go out and buy things. We don't know how long this crisis is going to last, and there's really nothing in this package that structures the government's response in such a way that it will continue to respond if the crisis continues. It's like the last package. It's sort of a one-off. If things stay bad, they have to come back to the table and keep addressing this over and over again. And every time they do that, Democrats have to negotiate with Mitch McConnell and with Donald Trump, who basically already have what they want. They got what they wanted in the first round negotiations, which was back in March. And that was about $4.5 trillion in money that can be used by the Federal Reserve however it wants, largely for corporations and particularly big corporations. So with an essentially unlimited bailout fund for corporate America already, in the bag, there's not a whole lot bringing Mitch McConnell back to the table to negotiate. That was, I think, a really terrible tactical decision the Democrats made back in March. I think they just underestimated what was happening. And I also think the party leadership is sort of indoctrinated indoctrinated is the wrong word because it makes it sound like they were sort of like tricked by somebody with a watch hypnotizing them or something. But they just sort of came of age in an era where the type of solutions that you draw on for economic and social problems were just very narrow. And this is not that kind of problem. This is a kind of problem. This is like a World War II style disaster that's taken place. And the government needs to have the kind of thinking that's commensurate with that crisis. And frankly, this is not the first major crisis where the party has, has sort of shrugged its shoulders, right? I mean, I think when you look at the climate crisis coming down the barrel, it's hard to say that the Democratic Party over the last decade has been putting forward ideas or solutions that really meet the moment. There's a group of people who are trying to. They're a faction of the Progressive Caucus. The entire Progressive Caucus is not actually on board with this, but Pramila Jayapal, who's the head of the Progressive Caucus, was trying to do two things. One was to get payroll support for workers. So instead of coming up with these different support funds where we give $1 trillion here or $500 million there, she would just say, look, we're providing whatever money it takes to companies to keep people on payrolls. So we will give you money and you cannot lay people off. That's the deal. And we will keep giving you money so long as you keep people on payrolls. Why we didn't do that the first time around, it's still kind of baffling to me. There were people who were talking about it, just didn't make the cut. The other thing she was talking about was something called automatic stabilizers. These are things like food stamps, like unemployment benefits, a certain amount of spending or relief aid that just goes out automatically when conditions reach a certain threshold. If the unemployment rate's a certain level, we're automatically doling out this amount of money to states. If GDP is declining at this particular rate, we have some sort of automatic thing. Where Congress doesn't have to go and legislate and negotiate every single time. This is just something that we do, like sending out Social Security checks every month. So she wanted to do that too. That also didn't make the cut. Those were the sort of big ideas that I think were meeting the moment. And Nancy Pelosi just didn't want to have anything to do with it. And I really don't think it's ideological. I don't think Nancy Pelosi was trying to out left wing or out right wing Pramila Jayapal. I think she just sees Jayapal as somebody who represents a faction of the party that Pelosi does not respect and does not want to reward. So whatever it is that Jayapal is putting on the table is something that Pelosi wants to make sure dies a very public and ignominious death.
Right. And I think that's kind of, it might not be ideological per se. And I think a lot of these things actually, I didn't have a big stake in it, I guess, because I was sort of, in some respects tapped out of this argument. I didn't know how consequential it would be, but I think, back in 2018, as much as I'm not a Nancy Pelosi fan, it seemed to me that, sure, I guess she can be the speaker. There isn't, the people challenging her are not challenging her from, the left, they're challenging her from the right. Now, even though I'm, not at all impressed by a guy like Ryan, it strikes me that even just in terms of timelines here, this is somebody that has to think about the next 20, 30 years and might want to piss a few less people off and might be a little bit more open to kind of urgent help. So I see what you're saying about the ideology, but at the same time, if it really comes down to that she respects the sort of suburban national security state resistor types, and she's irritated by the sort of urban progressives, people who represent more left districts in Seattle or the Bronx or Minnesota or whatever. I guess my question is to what extent, if we're not framing that ideologically, what are we framing it in terms of just people who win in swing districts, people who fundraise better? What are we looking at here?
I think that the important point I want to make is that this is a moment where ideological things are in flux. But by ideology, I mean the go-to policies that you would like to see implemented, both regardless of circumstances on the ground, economically, empirically, and also in response to what's happening. People in the moderate wing of the Democratic Party are open to very big and aggressive plans right now. Mark Warner is calling for much more aggressive action than what Nancy Pelosi has done. And Mark Warner is not a radical guy. He was one of these kind of technocrat Democrats from the sort of Silicon Valley-esque part of Virginia, of Northern Virginia. And I think in the Republican Party, you see people like Josh Hawley, who, I think is a very, very conservative person, who is talking about, modified versions of some of the ideas that Jayapal is talking about with several important caveats. So I think what we will assign to these different factions of the party, whether they're urban progressives or suburban moderates, is kind of up in the air. Mm-hmm. And we don't really know how each piece of that of the coalition is going to come down supporting, what policies going forward. So with that in the air, it's just the fact that Pelosi wants to reward the moderates who, they're typically, moderate voters, but the suburban district people who she recruited for 2018, and she wants to keep down the people from the, what we typically call the progressive wing of the party, who are from the urban, more left liberal sort of sections of the country, who, have been challenging those, and the hegemony of that wing of the party for the last 2 years.
So I make this point a lot, and I'm hoping you can make it better than I do. If we look at what Pelosi's doing and who she's rewarding, and even some of the different signals that Biden's putting out, and he's sort of all over the place, which maybe you could talk to in a minute. But very practically, the reason that they're not meeting the moment right now is they are relying on this toolkit that was developed a couple of decades ago, and just call it the third way. And a lot of people like us would object to these policies in the best of times. We would say, even if the economy is booming, we want a universal social safety net. Even if the economy is booming, we have a vision of a government that just provides redistributive policies, abundance, empowers labor, doesn't just exist to basically try to train and equip people to compete in a global economy, kind of like what Clinton and Blair and people like that were doing with reengineering the social safety net. And, one of the points is that in the 90s, we would strongly disagree and fight against that pretty marginally, but it worked for the moment when you're going through tech booms. Like the objection is in terms of long-term strategy and also in terms of how your values around politics. In 2020, when Amy Klobuchar and Ben Sass put forward a bill, a piece of legislation now saying, here's a $4,000 training credit, everybody else is like what? That's like, me or you, walking into, to the U.S. Open and being like, all right, where are we in the draw? It's crazy. It just has nothing to do with anything that's happening. And so when you look at the kind of stagnation of the Democratic Party, I think that's important to tease out.
Well, first, I'm insulted by your lack of confidence in my tennis abilities. But
hey, man, I'm not a bet. I can pick up a game on courts. Look, you know what? Maybe look at you. You'll end up qualifying some type of Rocky Balboa return to the professional tour in a couple of years.
No, but I think you're basically right about that. I mean, and the thing is, during the presidential primary, when Klobuchar and other candidates were vying for the moderate vote within the party, trying to wrest that away from Joe Biden, they would roll out these proposals, and people who were knowledgeable about policy, who are not necessarily left wingers, would laugh at them. I mean, they would say, "This is really silly. This is not a smart way to do things. Like this kind of the era of this kind of governing is past." But because they were trying to win a particular kind of voter within the party, I think people thought, well, they can't really be serious about this.
Right.
And here we are in the worst economic crisis that any of us have ever lived through. Depending on how bad things get, there's no reason to believe that we will continue to call the economic downturn of the 1920s and 30s the Great Depression after this. So this is an absolute crisis. And the fact that they come out with a $4,000 refundable tax credit for job training, you just almost don't know where to start talking. It's like there are these ideas and this way of doing governing. I won't say politics, but governing that's just on autopilot and doesn't respond to conditions or to the intellectual mood of the country. One of the things that's kind of funny about the Biden campaign is that while Biden spent pretty much all of his career fighting for, whenever there was a split in the Democratic Party, he was always on the side of the conservatives in the party, saying like let's move the party right. but he is somebody who looks back and says, well, I can admit that I made mistakes. Like, he gave an interview, I think it was with Jake Tapper on CNN when he was leaving the Obama administration. Tapper asked him, what's the biggest mistake? And he said, I really wish I hadn't voted for the repeal of Glass-Steagall in 1999. This is a big bank deregulation bill. It ultimately fomented the financial crisis of 2008. So he's not incapable of changing his mind on these things. And you see sometimes his campaign says things like, we want to do a big Rooseveltian sort of LBJ, Great Society, New Deal kind of presidency. We're thinking big. We're thinking about like the ideas that Elizabeth Warren and Sanders were putting out there. And then you see that they're also talking to people like Larry Summers, who was one of the architects of that 1999 deregulation vote that Biden regrets. So even when they start thinking, when they know that there's this need to do something bigger and change the script, they just don't really know how to do it. They don't know who to talk to. And I'm not sure that is what we would conventionally call an ideological problem. I think ideologically the country's in shift. There's just a set of personnel at the top who is used to working with each other, and they don't take seriously people who aren't in that club. And because the Democratic Party has decided not to change the guard for 2020, it's anything can happen. The world is an unpredictable place, as the coronavirus crisis shows, I think. But I find it hard to imagine the party making the type of adjustments that it needs to do in order to have things like what we're living through right now not happen again or keep happening forever.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with the last part, but I think. Let me bring my sort of crude materialism in here. One of the things that leaps out to me is Biden is rhetorically all over the place. And I think because he's got this, basically because to me, he incorporates both facets of the third way. So the third way kind of remnants now is, and that's why there can, with the sort of Pelosi affluent suburbanite third way, the same people in the 90s who were all about, Bill Clinton talking about the death penalty and school uniforms. This same block of voters now, considers themselves to be very conscious or woke or whatever. But the economics are quite similar. I mean, because again, you're talking about people from the suburbs who are relatively high earners. I mean, you're talking about people who are still doing relatively well compared to, certainly, I mean, they're not in the topmost echelon, but they're also not, really hurting as so much of the population is. And so I think, Biden's connected to that. You got a lot of his voters from there, but he also has this sort of blue collar fixation, which has a lot more to do with sort of how he talks about things, not much to do with policy. But I think that's where occasionally you hear the Roosevelt stuff. But the thing that leaps out to me in terms of just the trajectory of the Democratic Party and where we are today and what Biden could even do is, when Bill Clinton was running in 1992, I think the commitment was he would not raise taxes on those making above $100,000 a year. And in that context, that was very much an indication that we're making a play for a broad swath of the middle class, and we're not doing quote unquote class warfare. And Biden, in addition to continuing to reiterate, obviously, that, that Sanders, Medicare for all is not on the table. I think the number he put out the other day is that nobody under 400,000 or 450,000. So, for all of this drama and all of these supposed changes, to me, it's like, there's the core number there that we have gotten so much more suburban, identified and it seems to me that regardless of what you ask these voters in polls, that's probably the policy set at the end of the day that they're going to be the most comfortable with. Their taxes won't go up. And, that makes perfect sense, but it doesn't seem to me a good base upon which to grow any type of progressive coalition from.
No, I mean, in an era of extreme economic inequality, which we are living in, I mean, this is the worst era for inequality that has existed since the 1920s. In some measures, it's worse. In an era of extreme inequality, the votes are where the money isn't. If there just aren't a lot of people who have a lot of money, that's what it means for there to be high levels of economic inequality. So I mean, there's an excellent essay in the Post today by a guy named James Kwok, who is a law professor at the University of Connecticut. It's a review of Thomas Piketty's new book, Capital and Ideology. Piketty's, of course, the French economist who wrote this big book called Capital a few years ago, which I think recentered the intellectual debate in economics away from growth and onto inequality. And in this book, one of the things Piketty is talking about is the way ideas and material changes in the economy interact and affect each other. I'll be perfectly honest, I haven't read the book. It's 1,100 pages, and I've been finishing up my own book and rolling it out. Just haven't had time. But James Kwok's essay is fabulous.
Of course, no worries.
It's a fabulous.
You're forgiven.
But one of the things that he talks about is this idea that when the liberal or left parties of the world, whether it's Democrats in the United States or Labor in Britain or the rest of Europe, when they've turned away from working people, which largely they have, and relied more on upper income professionals as their base, the class politics of the world have essentially disappeared. And for much of the 20th century, politics were defined by the give and take between the haves and the have-nots, between the rich and the rest. And they, as a result of the left parties sort of coalescing around wealthier people, we now have parties that fight over identity issues, and the intensity of the and the heat around identity politics in the United States right now, which I don't use in a pejorative way, but the intensity of those fights is a product, according to this Piketty book, of just that sort of denaturing and denuding of the economic fight in politics. That politics is not the arena where we adjudicate economic disputes. I think it's a really interesting point. I haven't read the book, so I have a lot more to think on about it. But I thought that essay, I think that gets to something that's there's something about that essay that just rings true to me. I read it and I thought this feels about right.
Oh, I mean, same to me. And I think, again, this is why, there's a lot of time spent having the honor of, interviewing Adolph Reed on this show, or even trying to just revive political legacies of people like A. Philip Randolph. But we're going to get to Keynes. But before that, can you just, the problems of the Democratic Party are endless, but just basically remind us what did get passed in that first big bailout, and that, as I read it from reading you primarily, that really is a McConnell bill. Steve Mnuchin, maybe the most powerful Treasury Secretary in history now. I mean, what, just remind everybody what's in that bill. I think we called it Grand Theft Bailout when we were first covering it.
Well, yeah. It's, look, there's two basic provisions. The main one is there's a new $500 billion fund overseen by Steve Mnuchin, which can be leveraged by the Federal Reserve up to 10 times over. So you get to $4.5 trillion. That can be used however the Fed and Mnuchin want. There are no real strings attached to how corporations use this money. To the extent that there are strings attached, Mnuchin can just waive those requirements. So money can go to corporations, bailout money can go to corporations, and they can keep paying dividends and buying back stock and just making payments directly to their shareholders with that money, instead of using it to retain workers or invest in new equipment or ideas or technology. So it's a very reckless mode of rescue, which is frankly modeled on the 2008 financial crisis bailouts, which most people, I think, in retrospect, would say were not a good model for how to do things. They did not result in the economy roaring back quickly. We had the worst recession since the Great Depression, and the political fallout from that, I think, ultimately gave us Donald Trump. So it's modeled on a bad idea, and what Democrats got in return for voting for this stuff was a short-term 4-month increase in unemployment benefits of $600 a week. Now, that is not chump change for a lot of people. Nope. If you lose your job now, you're making more money when you are not working than you were making if you were going to work. And that is, look, that's not nothing. That's real. But it runs out in 4 months, and there was no effort to keep anybody outside of the airline industry on payrolls. The airline industry, because the flight attendants union has a very effective negotiator in Sarah Nelson, just said, the airlines are going to get billions of dollars in relief, but they're not going to be allowed to lay anybody off as a condition of accepting this money. So that was a good thing. But that idea was out there. Congress had access to that idea because they did it for the airlines. They didn't do it for anybody else. That's basically the package. There's also a small business relief fund that hasn't worked very well.
So basically, the Republicans get structure, or let's just say the Republicans writ large, and I think a fair amount of Democrats, which are quite comfortable with the Geithner-Mnuchin model. And then, basically, if you were concerned about the well-being of working people, you got some immediate relief. The oligarchy got the structure of the bill, and the working people got some short-term meeting of immediate needs.
Somewhere. Yeah, and $1,200. I mean, there's a $1,200 check going out to everybody. It's also not nothing, but it's one check.
But again, it's like trillions of dollars potentially to re-engineer or consolidate basically monopoly capital in this country versus 4 months, $600 a week, and a $1,200 check.
And there's this weird sort of disconnect where Democrats insisted on means testing the $1,200 check, so that people who were making over like $75,000 a year didn't get the full $1,200, and if you're making over $100,000, you don't get any. Whatever you think of means testing in the abstract, in this case, that is just it just shows, I think confusion about what they're doing. Because the money that they're giving to corporations is money that they're giving to wealthy people. They're giving it to the wealthiest people in the world, and there's no restriction on how much they get. But when you're talking about, in this case, we're even talking about many of these sort of wealthier suburban voters who are part of the new Democratic coalition. We're saying, well, no, we want to make sure that we don't give you an extra $100 that you don't really need from this check, because we're trying to scale this thing down when it gets over $70,000 a year in income. And it economically just doesn't make a lot of sense. What's the big deal right now? Who cares if you overpay somebody by a few $100? Like, maybe they buy some more stuff. That's not a big problem.
Right. Of course.
But
and this is why they didn't do automatic stabilizers either, right?
Well, according to Nancy Pelosi, I mean, she gave a press conference where she said, look, this was not an idea that was just supported by the progressives. Everybody in our caucus thought this was a good idea. We all wanted to do this, but we got a bad score from the CBO on it. It's the Congressional Budget Office. They, are the people who say how much things cost. There's an official agency that just says how much different provisions cost. There is no official agency that says what's going to happen to unemployment, or no official agency that says what's going to happen to growth, or what's going to happen to social stability. But we do have an official agency that measures the accounting costs of each bill. And she said, look, the way that they scored this, we had like 2 years that were folded into one, and that made it too expensive. It'd be an extra like $300 billion. And she said, and we can't absorb that right now. So she basically said, everybody agreed to it, but they voted against it. They decided not to put it into the package based on an accounting technicality.
Of a hypothetical number in the future while we're in the middle of a cascading depression.
And look,
that's demented.
But there's no reason to think that she's not.
No, I think she's telling the truth. I think
this
is the way completely truthful. That's insane.
That's the way they do things. No, it is crazy. It's really crazy.
Yeah.
And it's not good policy making, but it is the way that policy gets made. And to me that it has the ring of truth too.
Yeah, I think it was Olympia Snow, one of the three Republicans that they got for the Obama stimulus, and I forget, but basically her vote to pass the thing was something like, I don't know, just I want a nice round number knocked off of this. It's just something like, 30 million just needs to, because I need to show people that I'm responsible. And then of course that translated into, probably districts that were picked up by the Tea Party because people didn't get back to work. And, just completely unnecessary human suffering and economic stupidity, but she needed that branding. So it certainly tracks. So Zach, let's do an alternative reality here for a second. Joe Biden is in his basement in Delaware. He's just finished talking to Charlemagne the God. He's hobbling over to the bathroom to wash his hands, hopefully. And his wife is about to do an Instagram live stream, and somebody hands him the phone and they say, Joe, I've got John on the phone. What is John Maynard Keynes saying to Joe Biden? And who is John Maynard Keynes, and why is he not like Larry Summers?
So John Maynard Keynes is the most, I think, most important economist, certainly since Adam Smith, maybe the most important economist who ever lived.
Fighting words.
I know. He is best known, I think, to most people as the guy who advocated for deficit spending in recessions. That's what they teach you in Econ 101. There's people are rational actors, and you want supply to be in equilibrium with demand, and that always happens, except when you have some sort of bad thing that happens for some unexplained reason. When that happens, governments need to spend money to lift the economy out of the doldrums. And Keynes is the guy who's responsible for this idea. And the reason I wrote this book was because Keynes did support deficit spending, but that is a very narrow interpretation of what Keynes did and what he represented. Keynes, to me, talked about doing economics in a way that it had not been done before. He says those basic assumptions about the economy, that we're all rational actors, that supply will equal demand, that we can know or have any ability to mathematically gauge the future. But those are just not true. That's not the way human beings operate, and that's not the way the world works. And so I think this is one of the principal differences between Keynes and somebody else who I think is associated with the left on economic thinking, like Karl Marx. Marx generally accepts a lot of the precepts of the classical economic worldview. With Keynes, there's no real reason to believe that tomorrow will necessarily look like today. Things happen in the world. It's an unpredictable place. And the very way that human beings make decisions about the future is based on uncertainty about the future. What does it mean to make a rational decision in the present when you don't know what's going to happen in the future? You can't calculate the return on an investment when you don't know what's going to happen in the world. And so he tried to look at economic problems as things that were solved from a more sort of philosophical and values-based position. There was a way that he wanted the world to look, and we had to find policies that would fit that vision of the world. We didn't look at accounting numbers and say, okay, because the equations add up in this particular way, these are the only policies that we have available on the table. It was about realizing a certain kind of world. And I think if he were on the phone with Joe Biden right now, he would say, look, first and foremost, you have a public health crisis that you have not met. You need contact tracers, you need nurses, you need people trained. The market's not going to do that for you. The government needs to be employing people and finding out a way to respond to the public health crisis. The second thing you would talk about would be the climate crisis, I think. This is a catastrophic change, and it requires global leadership. And the United States has got to find a way to work with governments, not to make agreements about lowering targets and agreeing to numbers that they're going to hit in the future, but to concrete policies that they're going to actually do to bring down emissions and to make the world a habitable place going forward. He would talk about economics as if it were a matter of war and peace, not dollars and cents. And I think that would be very confusing to Joe Biden, but I would hope he would be receptive.
Sorry,
that's what I mean. But I would hope he would be receptive to it. He's been, like you said, he's been kind of all over the place recently, and maybe he's ready to think about things differently.
Well, I think, I mean, we definitely, I don't want to get too much, into the weeds here. We definitely have a different view of Marx. I don't think that Marx was just accepting a kind of view of rational economic man. I think in some ways he's saying that, well, actually, maybe there's three different trajectories here that can help us further understand where Keynes is coming from and how it fits distinctly into, I guess, three competing economic paradigms. So there's the sort of neoclassical, neoliberal, which still dominates our world today. I mean, even as it's taken kind of a beating in the last, at least since 2008, but we still have not actually muscled through a political alternative to it, even as it's kind of come intellectually under fire. So that really proves how at least the interests behind it are incredibly resilient and powerful. And that's sort of a story of, economic self-interest, rational actors. The government should, well, I don't want to say get out of the way, because I think Quinn Sablodian did a very good job of explaining how, no, actually government is deeply in the way. It's just, tailoring the incentive structure to benefit certain types of actors, in this case, pretty small group of actors. And so if you look at something like the WTO, it's like, this is not global free for all. Yeah, just let everybody send ships to each other and trade and have fun. It's one of the most bureaucratic, technically regimented organizations in the world that just happens to favor pharmaceutical companies, financial services industry, Hollywood, whoever is behind closed doors writing the rules in their favor. And then we have this image of the Keynesian economics, and you've definitely expanded on this for me, but that it's not market fundamentalism, and that it basically says we need to have a kind of empirical dynamic interplay. There's certain things that market allocations make sense for. There's certain things you need government intervention for. And then that ultimately, and this is where it does get kind of philosophical, that the purpose of this stuff is to generate some broad sense of abundance so that people can actualize themselves, so they can actually live life. And this is where you get into kind of Keynes as a sort of bohemian figure and an artistic figure. I think, my reading of Marx is definitely is sort of that if we don't escape the market tyranny, then basically we will always at the end of the day get fed back into kind of basically neoclassical mindset or those types of economic policies, because the market is so destabilized, or capitalism, not the market. Capitalism is so destabilizing and it exerts so many forces on everything else that no matter what we do, we're constantly finding ourselves either in crisis or, and the most powerful sectors of society are always clawing back reforms. And so in order to actually step into that world of broader capacity and abundance, we need to truly democratize the form of the economic realm. And obviously the closest we see to that are things like, labor union power, worker cooperatives, things like that.
So with Keynes and Marx, you always have to be careful because they both wrote so much and they're not always consistent with themselves. So their ideas do change over time. Right. But I think, to make an oversimplification, I would say that broadly speaking, they have similar kind of visions for what a good life and a good society will look like. There is an essay by Marx called The German Ideology, which Keynes never read. It had not been translated into English during his lifetime. And in this essay, Marx says something like, in the communist utopia that of my dreams, we will have something like, I can fish in the morning and I can hunt in the afternoon and I can be a critical theorist in the evening without ever being a fisherman or a hunter or a critical theorist, that he would be a fully realized person and everyone would be that way. This is sort of what Keynes talks about in an essay from 1930 called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. He says, the scarcity that economics is based on, the idea that there are limited resources for unlimited needs or desires, we're really not in an era of limited resources in key respects. And so within a couple generations, people won't have any need to work more than 15 hours a day, and they will get to be artists and scientists. And it sounds very much like what Marx is talking about in that essay. I think the difference is we're talking about them philosophically, politically, just radically different people. But philosophically, I think Marx is deeply influenced by David Ricardo and the labor theory of value. And he says, look, David Ricardo was a 19th century economist, sort of a right-wing disciple of Adam Smith. And he says, look, what David Ricardo says about economics is true. It's just irrational and it will collapse and destroy itself. It's just socially destructive and can't last. And I think Keynes says, no, it's just not true. To make a deep simplification about the way they think about economics. I think what happens with the two of them, particularly in the 1930s, is you have political fights over social upheaval, and in particular the word revolution. This is when people are talking about revolting against the government. It's not a metaphorical revolution like the Bernie Sanders campaign is talking about. It's not the Velvet Revolution. People are talking about taking up arms against the state and overthrowing the government. And this just absolutely terrifies Keynes. He is completely horrified by this idea. He thinks that economic policy should be used to prevent that type of social upheaval, that you want people to get along with each other, that type of conflict is very dangerous and frightening. Part of that's a result of being scarred by the violence of the First World War. And part of it is just a more conservative temperament. He's just not, he likes the things that the economic world of the late 19th and early 20th century created for the upper class. He does not want to risk the upper class's ability to enjoy them, but he does want to democratize them. So he does want to make them available to other people. And he thinks that economic policy is one way you can do that. And to just bear down on the sort of radical implications that this type of thinking can have, it also has conservative implications, and that's the way I think he's generally been interpreted. But Keynes was the financial architect of the National Health Service in Britain.
Right.
He's the guy who helped steward the Beveridge Plan, this very broad social welfare state expansion that happens in the 1940s. That largely happens because of Keynes's work. He's the guy who gives it legitimacy. He runs the numbers and says, "Look, this is all very doable." And then he goes to the United States and gets a lot of money to help fund it too. So. He was not talking about just making sure that the economy comes out of a recession, because the government spends enough money. He was talking about having a society that felt cohesive, where people were on the same kind of team and part of the same social project. And that thinking, I think, depends on what you read in Marx, but I think Marx is much vaguer about what the future is going to look like than Keynes is. I think he's much more specific about what's wrong with the existing social order.
Yeah, I mean, there's critique of the Gotha program. I think that's I think what he actually envisioned happening is definitely a lot less clear. Although I think his read on Ricardo is that this explains how not just that it's true and it will inevitably implode because it's unjust, but actually that it's true in a way, but it's also concealing the actual relationship between labor and capital, and wages are concealing this theft of stolen labor time, which is profit. And that sort of inversion is really important. I mean, whether we accept it or not, I think that makes it not on a continuum. Those are three very, really clearly different views. Like if one view is, there's some geniuses that innovate and we need to sort of cater things around them. Let's say that's kind of classical and laissez-faire. And if Keynes is, we need to have this sort of dynamic interplay between government and private and sort of civic institutions and sort of create cohesion through using the best of them. Marx is, I think, ultimately Marx does want something. I think Keynes and Marx are kind of pointing towards different things, but I think Marx is definitely saying that at the end of the day, it's that cohesion is going to be really hard or impossible as long as capital and labor have the relationship they're having. And this actually kind of leads me maybe to a more practical question. And I get frustrated with, because sometimes actually I get into arguments with Marxists who almost like oppose Keynesian measures now because they almost are like, no, that'll never work. They almost have more like orthodox economics pre-revolution than some mainstream economists. But then on the other hand, I think that the Keynesian worldview, like, there was probably a period actually after Marx died and through the development of the German Social Democratic Party and through Keynes, where you could kind of say, maybe there is a way to sort of mediate this, possibly. If you have powerful labor, if you have national social democracies and so on, starting with the backlash to the Keynesian framework in the 70s and the sort of globalization of capital, this cohesion has been under siege across the world. It's been, fought back and reversed in the United States and Europe. And obviously the economic policies we've put over, in like World Bank, IMF packages have made it impossible for developing countries essentially to pursue this path of, what governments like the Pink Tide were trying to do in some ways. Very Keynesian. I mean, they weren't trying to abolish capitalism, but even that was a problem, for Western financial interests. So I think part of the reason we're coming back around to Marx is because some people and I'll finish in a second, like my friend Bhaskar Sankara has said, that temperamentally almost, sure, social democracy sounds nice. And it does sound good on some level if, this sort of balance framework can work in a way that delivers for all. But it hasn't been for decades. And it does seem to be that a major part of why it isn't is because of this rapacious capital class that has
communism. And that was true in Europe as well, where most states went much farther with the democratic social project than we did in the United States. So the idea that there was a clear distinction that was being made between multiple different visions of the world certainly was not something that the political right accepted. I mean, there was a big view, certainly intellectually, by people like Friedrich Hayek, to say, look, this is all socialism or communism, whatever word you want to do, and that is of a piece with everything that's been happening in both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The difference between the New Deal United States and Nazi Germany is essentially philosophically unimportant. And that way that we talk about socialism and capitalism, I think, is still with us in a lot of ways. Outside of the radical left, where there are a few thousand people who really know lots and lots of different political theory distinctions from reading left literature their whole lives. Most people just think communism means like the bad stuff, or socialism is just
right.
like the bad stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important to grapple with that political reality when you're dealing with people who aren't coming at politics from that same perspective. The other point is that I think for Keynesians, the deal that Keynes is offering is essentially, it ought to be irresistible in a democracy. We can all have the good stuff. We can all live like, Virginia Woolf and John Maynard Keynes in the 1920s, reading books and drinking champagne and making art and thinking and talking and having wonderful parties. And everybody can have access to that. But it has not been irresistible in democracies. It not only hasn't been implemented by conservative governments, people have continued to vote for conservative governments and put them in power. And not just in the United States, where we have a really broken voting system and this particularly weird constitution and political arrangement, but throughout Europe as well. And I think that's a really difficult question to answer. And I don't have good answers for why it is that people vote against this. But I think that's really the central issue philosophically for Keynesians going forward, that you have to figure out, look, if this is such a good idea to do things this way, why hasn't it worked? And typically the response, just to make it clear, is, well, because we haven't done it, because the neoliberals took over. But why? Why did the neoliberals get to take over? And then why did they stay in power for so long? And why has it been so difficult to dislodge them even after the financial crisis of 2008? And now the coronavirus crash, where the entire system of government keeps being discredited in whatever way it can be discredited.
First of all, I actually totally agree with you about the public perception of words like socialism. And I think it's a balance, because I think it would be a much better world, not necessarily if everybody was a Marxist, but certainly if people read and had an understanding. I mean, there's some lessons here that are obvious. And I think what I caught when you were talking about that Keynesian vision of everybody living this kind of materially abundant bohemian lifestyle, I think that's appealing to a lot of people. But I think one of the things that we're understanding and we have to find a balance with is the broad base of civil and legal rights in a plural religion or a different. We want to protect everyone civically and legally, and then culturally, maybe that is actually where we need to be genuinely laissez-faire. Like maybe because I think, well, exactly. And I think that that's, and as much as we, wire, something reactionary, which it does not necessarily need to be at all.
I think that's right.
So, I mean, I guess, yeah, I mean, I thought this was fascinating. I guess that's on this continuum of this idea of general abundance, but talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think when we think about Keynes as an economist, we think about him as a guy who's trying to, trying to find money to pay for things, right? And I just don't think that's the right way to think about his writing. I mean, he wrote so much over the course of his lifetime, and the way that he thought about economics fitting into his system of ideas was very much the way other big Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke or Isaac Newton or John Stuart Mill, sort of later descendants of this tradition, thought about it. It was one piece of a bigger philosophical project, and he definitely believed he has a great deal of reverence for this project. He's very much a traditionalist in the sense he likes Enlightenment liberalism a lot. He thinks it's been a successful project largely. But he also sees a lot of tensions within it. He likes somebody like Edmund Burke quite a bit. He thinks that Burke's fears about revolution are a little bit overblown, but basically the emphasis on social stability is important. That social upheaval often does result in things that we don't want to see happening from a more conventionally progressive perspective. He thinks Burke is maybe wrong about democracy, but he's open to agree with him on him if democracy just doesn't seem to work out so well. But he also really likes the kind of radical egalitarianism of somebody like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and he thinks that the reason that this sort of family of thought that he calls the Enlightenment has survived so long is because economically the policies of laissez-faire, I don't think he would have used the word capitalism, but laissez-faire economics have been successful in convincing members from different camps that this is the best way to achieve it. What are essentially different goals. That people who love the property rights of the rich like laissez-faire because they think it protects their property rights. People who worry about the excesses and arbitrary, punitive, works of a nasty sovereign see it reining them in. So this will bring together all of these different sort of disparate Enlightenment factions. And if laissez-faire doesn't deliver the goods, if it doesn't actually produce some sort of generalized prosperity, then that coalition is going to fall apart. And what we think of as Enlightenment liberalism will just politically die. So he is very much somebody who was trying to save that project. To reinvent it, I think it is an important way to say it. He's not just trying to do Rousseau or Burke again, but he's talking with people like Friedrich Hayek because he thinks that liberalism is a good thing that's worth saving, and he thinks what Hayek is going to do, what the neoliberals ultimately, by the 1970s triumph with, will destroy that project.
He was right about that.
It's hard to disagree. I think looking back on the last 20 years.
Actual last question. Do you think it's worth distinguishing? And I distinguish between capitalism and markets. And I think the idea of moving into post-capitalism, I think there's a lot of very obvious arguments for it, particularly when you start getting into ecological concerns. So things that are commons are not things that should be in highly concentrated monopoly capital firms like oil or timber or water, these things that still drive so much of the global economy and resource conflicts. But this idea that, and I think this goes back to the popular conversation we were having before and people's concerns. You'll say something about capitalism where I'm clearly talking about the commanding heights of the economy or things that we don't necessarily want to put in private hands, like the genetic code or other commons resources. I really think we need to revive the commons as a framework. And then some people, with that training, they'll say, "Oh, so you're saying, I can't, I can't subscribe to your podcast that way, or I can't go to the farmer's market, or I can't go to this nice little Airbnb, this nice little bed and breakfast. Actually, maybe you can't go to the Airbnb, but and it's like, of course, that's not what we're talking about here. We're not, that somehow there needs to be a distinction between markets as things that probably do pop up in a lot of different contexts and do certain sets of things well in context, simplify certain exchanges, versus capitalism as a mode of production that is, I think, really running out of steam, at least for meeting actual societal and ecological problems.
It really, to me, it just depends on how you're using the word and how you're defining it. I mean, I think a word like capitalism, a word like socialism, I feel like there's so much political flexibility in those terms that, if you say you're against capitalism, maybe I am too, but maybe I'm not. It depends on what you mean. I think the last 25 years, the financialization of everything, the conversion of all aspects of society into financial markets and into the product of financial markets, I think is a really bad way to organize society. I think people really like farmers markets, and I think farmers markets offer a lot of nice things at reasonable prices. I think, when you talk about markets, do you mean financial markets or do you mean farmers markets? And if you mean farmers markets, how do we get those? I think that to me is a very productive way of making these distinctions. But ultimately, it depends on the policy. There are some areas where markets just don't work at all. I mean, I think healthcare, really clear, it's just not getting the job done right now. Other things, I think, the market for luxury cars is probably fine. I don't have a real problem with how that one's functioning. But it depends on the sector of society.
I do, because I'm a Keynesian and I want everybody to have a BMW driving experience. What's going on with you, Zach? You just gave a very Clintonian answer there. The book is The Price of Peace. This is an incredible accomplishment, this book, I have to say, Zach.
Thank you, Michael.
Money, Democracy, and the Life of John Maynard Keynes. I really appreciate it, and I hope you'll come back on again soon and keep talking about what's actually getting put inside these bailout packages, because I guess they'll keep being more until, as Nouriel Roubini says, we'll have food riots, and then the only things that work in American government right now are the Fed and the military. So at least we're still going through the Fed.
At least we've got the Fed. Yeah. The most progressive institution in the history of the country. Michael, it's always great talking to you. Thanks so much for having me, guys.
I really appreciate it. Thanks, man. All right, everybody. Take care.